Hello, this is Clark, and today I want to talk to you about 3 ways to help you understand the Bible in its context. You've probably heard the phrase, "you're taking me out of context." This is something that's very familiar to us when we're studying the Bible. If you take the scripture in its context, a lot of times we will hear that there are verses that are taken out of context. If you sell real estate, it's location, location, location. If you're a Bible student, it's context, context, context. A good place to start is by getting a summary or an overview of the book that you're reading. For instance, if you're reading 1 Peter or Ephesians or whatever book in the scripture that you're reading, it's a good idea to just simply Google an overview of the book of Ephesians, or you could put in a summary of the book of Ephesians. There are several good sites out there that will help you just get a feel for what that book is about. Insight for Living Ministries is a good option. Greg Koukl at Stand to Reason says, never read a Bible verse. I take this as a very good information to use, because it's never a good idea to just read a verse, because a lot of times we will take it out of context unless you read the scripture around it. Sometimes, honestly, it's a good idea to read the entire book. Keep in mind that, for instance, when Paul wrote the book of Romans, he was writing a letter to a church. And so if you want to get the whole idea or the context of that letter, it's a good idea to read the entire book in order to get its context and understand what he's talking about. So 3 things to help you understand the Bible in its context. Number 1, who is the author? So if you're reading a biography about George Washington, you might want to know who the author is. Is this someone who actually knew George Washington? Is it someone who lived during the same time period as George Washington? Or is it someone who's just studied about George Washington? If it's someone who actually lived and knew George Washington, you're more likely to get a lot more in-depth, good information. And when we're reading the Bible, we see this same thing take place. Understand who your author is. For instance, the book of Luke was written by a doctor whose name was Luke, and he also wrote the book of Acts, and you can continue that through and see that he's basically telling one story. He's writing it to one man, a man by the name of Theophilus, and he says, I want to give you a more orderly account of what happened. And so Luke actually writes out the account. Some of it he heard from Peter, some of it he heard from Paul when he was on trips with him. But we understand when we know the author, who is a second-hand witness, so to speak, he knew actual witnesses of Jesus Christ. If you're reading the book of Peter, understand that he was one of Jesus' disciples. He lived with him. He knew him. The book of James is written by James, who is none other than the brother of Jesus Christ. At one point in the book of Mark, we understand that James didn't even believe that Jesus was the Messiah. It says that even his own brothers didn't believe him. But because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, James understood that yes, this was the Son of God. And when we read his book and know not only that he was an eyewitness, but that he was a brother, someone who knew him and knew him very well. If you understand who the author is, it helps you understand the Bible in its context. Secondly, understand the time period. If you're reading a letter to a church and it talks about the horses outside, it might make a lot more sense if you understand this letter was written to a church in the 1800s. If you're reading it now, we're going to wonder, why are they talking about horses? The same thing goes when you're reading a book in the Bible. If you're reading the book of Genesis, understand that it's at least 1,500 years before Jesus Christ. So by the time you get to the New Testament and you're reading the book of Luke or the book of John, it's a completely and totally different time period. An example of this is in the book of Titus. When Paul is writing this pastoral epistle, in other words, he's writing it to a pastor or to a leader in the church whose name was Titus. And he says, Titus, I sent you here, or I'm leaving you here, I'm writing this so that you will ordain elders here in this church. He says, some of the prophets there in Crete have even said that they're liars, evil beasts, and slow bellies, or basically lazy gluttons. But does this mean if you know of someone from Crete today that they're automatically a liar or a lazy glutton? Of course not. have to understand the time period and the author and what Paul is trying to communicate to Titus so he can start this church. Thirdly, understand the place that this is written to. A letter to a church that's talking about silencing your cell phones will have a completely different meaning to a group of people who are worshiping underground, who are afraid that the government's going to come in and kill them literally for worshiping. If they may be in North Korea or in one of the Middle Eastern countries where it's a crime to study the scripture, it'll have a completely different meaning to them than to someone in America who reads the lines, whether it's a text or on the screen, that says silence your cell phones. Because we're not worried about that. Basically, we just want to make sure that we can hear and we're not interrupted. It has a completely and totally different meaning. The same thing, like, for instance, if you're reading the book of Philippi, which was written by Paul, when he talks about the women who labored with me in the gospel, it makes more sense to understand the place. One easy way to do that is just to look at the book of Acts, which is a history of Paul and his journeys and of the churches that he helped start. One of those was at Philippi. When Paul has this vision, he says that there's a man from Macedonia that says, come over and help us. Well, they make the voyage, they make it to Philippi, which was a big city in Macedonia. And Paul, of course, he had this vision saying, come help us. But when he gets there, they go out on the Sabbath day, and all they could find was some women gathered by the river. One of these was Lydia, who basically probably started that church. She's one that she said, you can come to my house and we can talk about this. And of course, I'm paraphrasing. But when we understand where it's at, the place, it helps us understand the context, helps us understand what Paul is talking about when he writes this letter to the church of Philippi. So if you understand the place, you understand the time, and you also understand exactly who the author is, it really helps you understand the context, and it will help the scripture make a whole lot more sense. And I hope this will help you understand the Bible in its context.